Hello, boys and girls. Today I'm going to read to you another book from R.C. Sproul called The Lightlings. God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. One evening, in a house in a quiet neighborhood, a little boy was getting ready for bed. The boy's name was Charlie Cobb. As his mother was tucking him in, she covered him with blankets to make him warm and cozy. She knelt by his bed and prayed with him. Then she stood, leaned over, and kissed his forehead. Charlie looked up at her and said, "Mommy, please don't forget to turn on the night light, before you leave my room." Mrs. Cobb smiled at him and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll be sure to turn on the light. I won't leave you in the dark." So Charlie's mother gave him one last kiss and finished tucking him in and turned on the night light next to his bed. Just as she was ready to leave, Charlie said, "Mommy, why am I afraid of the dark?" She said, "Well, that's a hard question to answer, Charlie. I think we're going to have to save that question for Grandpa. He's coming to dinner tomorrow. You can ask him then." "All right, Mommy," Charlie said. "I'll wait till tomorrow and ask Grandpa about it." The next day, just as Charlie's mother had promised, Grandpa came to dinner. Before they moved to the table, Charlie went and sat on Grandpa's knee and said, "Grandpa, may I ask you a question that's really bothering me?" Grandpa smiled and said, "Well, of course, Charlie. Tell me what you'd like to know." Charlie said, "Grandpa, why am I afraid of the dark? And why do so many people I know seem to be afraid of the dark too?" Grandpa looked at Charlie and said, "Well, that's a very good question. But you know, not only are lots of people afraid of the dark, but many people are afraid of the light." "Afraid of the light?" said Charlie. "Why would that be?" Grandpa said, "Well, to understand that, I have to start at the beginning. In fact, at the very beginning." Now, Charlie loved it when Grandpa told him stories, so he curled up next to Grandpa and waited for him to begin. Grandpa started his story the way he always did. Once upon a time, there was a great king who was the king of light. He lived in the light, and he made the light, and his light was so perfect and so pure that he was called the King Without a Shadow. This great king of light made a group of people, and he made them so that they could shine brightly, just as he did. He called them his little lightlings. He set the lightlings in a beautiful garden that he prepared for them, a garden that was full of bright sunshine. The sun bathed the garden every day and helped the flowers, plants, and fruit grow in great abundance. The bright light of the sun helped keep everyone warm in the garden. The lightlings loved it when the king came to visit them at the end of the day. But one day, something terrible happened. The lightlings decided to do what they wanted to do, instead of what their king had commanded them to do. So they disobeyed their king, and they sinned against him. The very moment they sinned, their lights became dim, and they were filled with shame and great embarrassment. They ran as fast as they could to get away from the king. They didn't want the king of light to see them. They ran out of the garden and into the woods, and they hid themselves in the darkest place they could find. From then on, they were afraid of the light, because they knew that where the light was, the king would be, and that the king would see them in their shame. After the lightlings left, the king began to remove his light from the garden, and it soon became cold and covered with weeds and thorns and sticky briars. The lightlings moved further and further into the woods until they lived in a place that was almost completely covered in darkness. It was so dark they had to grope around as if they were blind, feeling their way through the forest. Often they would trip and fall, scuffing their knees and bruising themselves. It was awful living in the dreadful darkness all the time, where the only light they ever saw was in barely lit shadows that danced in the forest. In fact, they couldn't tell the difference anymore between night and day. Then one night, or perhaps it was day, far off in the distance, they saw a blinding light shining through the trees. They could see the light coming from miles and miles away. They were frightened by it. They thought the light meant the king was coming to find them and punish them for their sins. So, most of the Lightlings began to stumble quickly away from the light. But some of the Lightling children were so amazed by the light and curious about it that they decided to see where it was coming from. They set off and traveled for miles and miles. It took them a long time, but as they moved, they saw the light shining brighter and brighter. Finally, they came to a clearing in the forest. In the middle of the clearing, they saw a father Lightling and a mother Lightling and a baby. And the baby was shining like the sun. The blazing light seemed to be coming right out of the baby himself. The Lightlings who saw it were shocked and surprised. They asked the father Lightling, "Who is this baby? Where did he come from?" The father Lightling answered, "He is not my son. He is the son of the King of Light. The king has given him to us as a special gift. He's been born for us. When he grows up, he will be called the light of the world. There will be no darkness strong enough to hide his light, no darkness deep enough to send his light away." When they heard this, the Lightling children knelt down at the baby's feet and began to worship him in fear and reverence. When they stood up again, their own faces were shining. But the light that was shining in their faces was not coming from inside of them. It was a reflection of the light coming out of the baby. The Lightlings were now surrounded with the light of the child that they had visited. They rushed back to their homes, their friends, and their families as fast as their feet could carry them. And when they got home, they were still shining. The other Lightlings were frightened at the sight of them. They said, "What happened to you?" So the Lightling children told their story. "We saw a baby who was shining with light. He is the son of the King of Light. The king has given us a child, and he has given us his own son to be the light of the world." Well, the Lightlings noticed that already there was more light in the forest. Now they could begin to see where they were going. They could walk without falling. They could run and play without bumping into trees or rocks and getting bruised. Some still hid from the light, but others realized they didn't need to be afraid anymore. They saw that living in the light was much better than the darkness they were used to. Grandpa looked at Charlie and said, "You see, Charlie, we're afraid of the dark because we were made to live in the light. But someday all of us who love this sun will live with him forever in heaven. When we go to the dwelling place of the Son, who is now the light of the world, there will be no darkness at all. And not only that, there will be no moon. There won't be any stars or even a sun. There will be no night lights, no lamps, no lanterns, not even any candles." Charlie asked, "How can it be light there if there's no sun or lamp or candles? How can that be?" His grandfather replied, "In the place where the king's son now lives, the light that shines forever still comes from him. He is the light of heaven. All who come into his presence will never be in darkness again." "Wow," Charlie said. "That sure is a wonderful thing to look forward to." And Grandpa replied, "Charlie, let me make a suggestion. Every time you see the sun, the moon, or the stars, or light a candle or turn on your nightlight, you remember the story of the child the King of Light brought into the darkness of the world, and remember that he gave us this baby as a present. As long as you remember that, you will never, ever have to be afraid of the darkness again."